Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting. Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten, your host. Today we have back with us David Ramirez. He's the pastor of St. Paul Lutheran Church in Union Grove, Wisconsin. Welcome back, Ramirez.
Awesome to be here.
All right. So every once in a while, you get a seismic shift in thinking, and it affects almost every kind of area in life, such that the assumptions that were previously there can no longer be there. And we saw that in the Great Awakenings in the United States. And, it sounds like you have been making a presentation that says there is kind of a third Great Awakening, only it's called the Great Awokening. Tie your thinking on the Great Awokening to the Great Awakenings, and kind of just introduce us to what you see the Great Awakening is. And as we move forward, we can talk about what we should do about it.
Yeah, sure. No problem. So the Great Awakening is not a term that I came up with, but it is a a really wonderful term. And it obviously is alluding to the Great Awakening, which happened right before, during, and after the American Revolution in what would be and became the United States. And the Great Awakening was just a huge, as you said, seismic shift in religio-political thinking among those colonists. And without getting into the details of that, however, if you want to get into the details of that, there's a wonderful book called The Democratization of American Christianity by Nathan Hatch. It's just a fabulous book, and it really points out that because some people think that the Great Awakening was a primarily quote-unquote conservative or traditionalist shift, especially when they're only considering the religious side of things. But he really makes the point that this was really a revolutionary, seismic religio-political shift. But the point for us today is not to delve into that so much as to say everyone recognizes that the Great Awakening was a huge, huge shift. And it just changed so many things in terms of culture, politics, religion. It was truly revolutionary. And we too have gone through a comparable revolutionary seismic shift in America over the last 10 years, roughly. And notice I said we have gone through it, not that we are going through it. It basically already has happened. And just like the Great Awakening, not everyone shifted. I mean, the Great Awakening, lots of people jumped on to what that shift was all about. And again, like I said, if you want to learn more about that, check out Hatch's book. But not everyone moved. And there were certain contours to that shift that are definitely worth looking into if you really want to understand it. Both the people who shifted and the people who didn't and who were reactionary forces against it or wanted to preserve what came before. I like to use the analogy of a teeter-totter. I mean, if you've got 10 kids, I mean, you're not going to have 10 kids on a teeter-totter at a time. Well, maybe you would. I mean, kids do some ridiculous things on the playground. But
not
if you have
days.
10, well, that's true. Yeah, the nanny state has taken care of all fun on the playground. I like those memes about like how old playground equipment was, were death traps, and I certainly remember that. Everything on like asphalt and concrete, you die, you at least break an arm, or, you fall, you die or break an arm, and. But yeah, so if you got a teeter-totter and you got, let's just say 10 kids on there for the sake of argument, to flip it, even assuming if they're all the same size, to upend the teeter-totter, if you have an equilibrium, does not mean you need all 5 kids on one side to switch sides. Sometimes it only takes one, but even if you only have 2 out of the 5 make a shift, a significant shift, it upends the entire equilibrium, and that is what a seismic shift is all about. It is upending the status quo. And that's really what we've gone through with what some commentators have termed the Great Awokening. And it really harkens back to that Great Awakening time period in American history, because this is not just about politics. It is a religio-political shift that affects political matters, but also lots of religious attitudes as well. And it really has reshaped our culture. Now, everyone, I'm sure, who's listening says, yeah, of course, what he's talking about, we all lived through over the last 10 years. Certain things that were unthinkable in 2010 are now mainstream. I think one of the most shocking examples of that is all the transgenderism stuff.
Right.
And there's this great quote. I can't quote it by perfectly right now, but it's in the presentation in the paper that I gave just recently on this. That what used to be considered fringe beliefs that only grievance study majors believed in have now become mainstream, seemingly overnight, and we have gone through this shift, and it is a very disconcerting and destabilizing thing. And I think all of the listeners would recognize that the world seems very, very different than 10, 15 years ago. However, I think that drilling down into the data is very helpful, because just like anytime you approach a problem, whether it be as a pastor, as a father, as a citizen, as a son or a daughter or whatnot, as an employee, you need to know the circumstances so you can faithfully react to it. And so in the same way, it's just been so earth-shaking, and so I think it's worth knowing the particular contours, not just, boy, things have shifted, but who shifted, who switched sides on the teeter-totter, so to speak. So,
that's a great point. And is it a who, or is it just particular ideas, particular data points that are most prominent in creating that shift?
Well, it really is both. It really is both. The ideas are very different stances on a whole host of causes, whether it be ones to do with racial issues, or things to do with I don't like the term, but sexuality, whether it be LGBTQ, whatever. Certainly the ideas are important, but in terms of why this shift, I mean, lots of the particular items we'll be talking about are very particular, and but they've been around for a while. But it really is about, as you asked, the who has shifted on these things. And that's why drilling down into the data and thinking about the who and also the how, even though that's harder to really get a firm grasp on, but the who is actually astoundingly provable. But I'd like to back up and just talk a little bit about where we got that word woke from, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So the Great Awokening is, kind of pushing together that term, the Great Awakening, with the term woke. And the term woke was originally a slang term in American Black culture to describe a person who is aware of injustices and problems with, I guess you could say, traditional societal structure in America and perhaps elsewhere in the West, but particularly or primarily concerning issues to do with race. But obviously that term woke didn't stay there. It really got popularized after, it's been around for much longer, but it got popularized after all the Ferguson riots in 2014. Yeah. And it got used with BLM, Black Lives Matter, the organization and the movement. But it then became very swiftly, it kind of kept on going from there. And the term was used not just for people who were woke to racial injustices and not just exclusive to Black Americans, but also it became associated with and used by lots of other social justice groups and linked with a whole host of leftist causes. So even though the particular term started out concerning race relations, and particularly in American Black, it was a slang term. It kind of got adopted by all of what you could broadly call leftist causes and positions and ideas. But what's interesting is that even though the term itself started out in American Black popular culture, or you could even say, pop culture, but especially on the internet, the particular group of people that shifted in their views on not just race relations, but the whole host of kind of leftist ideals and beliefs. The people who shifted were actually white liberal Americans. They were the ones who got off the teeter-totter and shifted to a very radically new position. And that who has been very well documented, actually, that it's the white liberals who have actually shifted, who have become woke. And just like in the Great Awakening, not everyone became, woke back in the Great Awakening. There were lots of people who said these new forms of worship and political ideals, we don't like them. There were lots of reactionary forces against that. And so too today, it's incredible how well it's been documented by a whole host of researchers and cultural observers and columnists from the right, from the left, from the center. They really all agree about the main contours of not just what the Great Awakening was all about, but also who shifted, and it is white liberals. If you don't, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just was going to ask then, if that's who shifted, what did they shift over?
Sure. Well, I'd like to read or name a couple of really important researchers, so that if people want to dig deeper, they can. Because I don't want to try and just read all of this, these quotes and things like that. But there was if you're interested in this, there's a great article by Zach Goldberg entitled "America's White Saviors," and that's an article that you can find online. And he writes, a sea change has taken place in American political life. The force driving this change is the digital era style of moral politics known as wokeness. And then he talks about how this, has been measured and things like that. He talks about what I've already summarized of how the term originated in, American Black pop culture. But he really points out that the attitudes about racial and social justice questions of specifically white liberals have become radically more liberal. And he points to another article that I want to mention, and that is an article by Matthew Iglesias called "The Great Awakening." I believe he's the one who came up with the term, but I'm not quite sure. But in that's another article that's available online. And there's several charts that he has in that article that show how on specifically racial issues, black-white relations, and also questions about immigration, white liberals over the last 10 years have shifted not just way further to the left relative of where they were, but also to the left of Black, Hispanic, and other ethnic minority groups in America. That's how far left they've shifted. It's just absolutely incredible. It's astounding. But as I alluded to, it's not just on race relations, but a whole host of social justice, quote unquote, issues. And I'm sorry, I wanted to back up and mention the New York Times. The New York Times has been used as kind of a testing ground to see
Kind of like a barometer.
Yeah, thank you. I was looking for that word literally. Yeah, a barometer of how people have been thinking about this and talking about it. And there's people who've done their whole PhDs on this actually, and they really have. I mean, it's amazing, but I'm glad they did it, because what they've discovered is that on, for instance, there's a great chart about article. This is a chart that I believe was put together by David Rosado, who's another person who's documented this, as well as Zach Goldberg, who I mentioned earlier. The percentage of annual number of New York Times articles mentioning racism, and it was 0.5% in the early 2010s, and then by the time you get to 2016, it's over 2%. 2016-17. Issues of identity, who is white, who is black, or African American, or Negro, it just rockets up. And some commentators have said that all of these charts look like hockey sticks. It's relatively stable, and then it shoots up like if a hockey stick was laying on the ground with the end pointed up. And you see this again and again, not just in issues concerning race, but also issues concerning a whole host of positions.
Yeah. So that's interesting because, I mean, growing up in the 90s and, heading to seminary in the early 2000s, I kind of thought that we had dealt with the race issue.
Yeah. Not so much, huh?
And perhaps, right, the people who are the age of my parents and older felt the same way, particularly after 2008 with the election of Barack Obama to be president. What was that naive, or is there something else that's going on?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think that intrinsically multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic or racial, any time when you have a culture that is multicultural, it's going to be intrinsically more unstable than a culture that has a very, very dominant majority that is unified on all of those fronts. That's just baked into the cake.
Yeah. So instead of being the melting pot, we weren't that anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think
we were segmented more than we thought.
Right, and also the whole. I mean, that's, I guess, a whole nother discussion. But the whole melting pot idea presupposes that that you're actually not going to be multi, but you're actually going to be a new unified thing.
Yeah,
and I guess
exactly.
That's my deeper point, that a multicultural, whether that being ethnic or cultural or religious, those are much more inherently unstable. But to the second point is that we have seen that there's been waves of pushes by the left. Like you were talking about growing up in the 90s, and then by the early 2000s, a lot of people thought these struggles were over. But I think we can see these waves. In the 60s, there's a big push by the left. And when I say left, I don't just mean, political left, but more expansively, folks that really do not like Western Christian civilization and who really subscribe to a form of humanism. And if if the listeners want to read about that, they should really read some of Walther's works on that. But there was a wave in the 60s. I think there was a wave in the 90s. I remember that growing up. I mean, you're what, 10, 12 years older than me? Is that right?
Yeah, right.
It's 4, right? 4 or 5.
Yeah.
I couldn't help myself. I'm sorry. But I do remember growing up in the 90s, especially around Columbus, the 500th anniversary of Columbus. And,
right.
All this stuff about, anti-Western stuff. And PC was a big thing. There was even that movie PCU, which I never saw, but I mean that was in the water, and multiculturalism was a big hot word. And I think that's why that lull tricked people into thinking that we were over this. There's the big wave in the '60s, then there was, I think, a perhaps smaller but still very significant wave in the '90s. Maybe I mean that's a different discussion. But then there was that lull, and now there's another big wave. But I think the wave that we experienced is not, it is comparable, and it builds upon the '60s and the '90s, but it is so much greater because it has totally upended so many things, and the shift is just so incredible. If I could just, and also it's a whole host of things. We've been focused on where the term came from and race relations, and the struggles of a multicultural society. But it's not just that. It's also these guys that have documented this with their charts, these hockey stick charts. Also, everything to do with sexuality, whether the term is sexism or homophobia or Islamophobia or transphobia or patriarchy or anti-Semitic, or I mean, all of these words just exploded in their use, and not just in terms of their raw usage in these publications, but the percentage of their use, and that just shows how much this was just a thing that was incredibly important during the time period of about 2012 or 13 to 2016 and 17. There's a great chart that I'm looking at right now, but it goes through a host of 40 words that are, classic SJW, social justice warrior words that are all about prejudice. And, these researchers put it together with these 40 words in 47 popular news media outlets. And that hockey stick thing is just right there. It truly is incredible. David Rosado actually was the one who put that together. And it's just incredible.
So how do you answer the critique that would try to say that this hockey stick formation is basically because it needed to come out in order to oppose, the racist, xenophobic, sexist Donald Trump?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, because a lot of people kind of misremember their history and think that this is a reaction against Trump. But these guys who have dug into the data, this was already well on its way long before Donald Trump came on the scene. Actually, the researchers, right, left, and center, all agree on this. This was not driven by a reaction to Trump, especially if you think about those years. 2012 or 13 is when it got kicked off, this Great Awokening. And not just how much people were talking about it, but the shift in political attitudes as well, as we talked about earlier, and white liberals moving to the left of where they were radically. This was already kicked off and more than halfway accomplished by the time Trump really kicked off his campaign and certainly his presidency. It was kind of winding down. What's more proper to say is that actually the Trump campaign and presidency and the movement and the people around him, or were excited about him, were a reaction to the Great Awakening. That's actually the proper way. And that's provable. That's not even like up for debate. That's just how it played out.
Yeah.
Another front that the big shift happened on is actually abortion. So now white liberals are further to the left than anyone else in kind of the left Democratic coalition on abortion. I mean, it just is astounding. They're actually the ones driving the pro-choice stance of the Democratic Party, to drill down a little bit more closely on that issue. So I mean, the shift is just incredible, and I personally think we all have seen this in our families and our circles of friends, where I mean, families have been torn apart over this.
Yeah. So how does this affect the church and the people of the church and in the church, and what should its response be?
Well, I mean, I think that so many of these issues, the attack upon Western Christian, uh, patriarchal, civilization
Hmm.
is something that we have to push back on. Uh, I mean, the assault on the church and the church's teaching on a whole host of moral/ethical issues is obviously something we need to teach against. Um,
Hmm.
and so how do we push back? I think there's a couple places that we, I mean, there's a whole, I mean, we could talk for hours about it, but
Yeah.
I'd bring up three things. One would be is that the Great Awokening has been a disaster for race relations in America. I mean, we were already talking about how multicultural or multi-religious, uh, you know, uh, ethnic countries or communities, there's going to be some baked in instability. But boy, uh, it's been a disaster for race relations. It
Hmm.
is really horrible. And there are so many anti-biblical claims of like the Black Lives Movement, critical race theory, and all these woke organizations, and they really do stem from a humanistic conception of the world. I mean, they're utopianists, and communism is a species of utopianism, and these things are not just bad political ideas, but they truly are rooted in an anti-biblical, anti-God stance. And in the church, where we could start is actually seeing and acknowledging that we're infected already. Um, there's an organization in the Missouri Synod, or at least run by Missouri Synod pastors, Lutherans for Racial Justice, and their talking points, maybe not every single one, but I mean they sound like SJW talking points. There was an article that came out back in 2020 called a Lutheran Case for Reparations. I mean, it's a ridiculous article. It's not worth reading. It's as silly as it sounds, but it was written by a Missouri Synod pastor, and I've personally been kind of shocked at how weak, uh, the or how reticent many people in the Missouri Synod were to condemn, kind of the riots back in 2020,
Hmm.
which did have a racial component to it, even though it wasn't exactly a, a black, white, or whatnot issue. But there was the BLM component to it, and I mean, this is not going to help anything. No matter how we're going to move forward, race baiting and all this, all rioting is not going to help. And so
Right.
I was kind of shocked at that. And also, I've been kind of shocked in some quarters the weak stance on breaking the law concerning illegal immigration. It's kind of incredible. So I think we got to get over trying to uh, pacify those who are humanists. And if we're only nice enough to them, then we won't get called racists. I think that's just silly. I mean,
Yeah.
racism is usually just a slur that doesn't mean anything, and we got to stop cringing
Yeah.
whenever other folks say that. So I think that's one way.
Well, the reality is, under its current definition, by the very fact that we are white male Christians, we're de facto racists.
Yeah, I mean that's the CRT take, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um,
In other
and
words, you can't escape it.
No, you can't. No, I mean, and the
Right.
Missouri Synod can't escape it. The Missouri Synod is overwhelmingly white, and more specifically, German American, and
Hmm.
that is not something to be ashamed of. Obviously, the gospel's for all people and all tribes and all nations. But
Hmm.
if all we're going to do is be scared to be called racists and not actually, uh, you know, speak against bad stuff like BLM or CRT, then we're not going to be effective. I mean, our enemies don't care how nice we are. Our niceness is going to get us in real trouble.
Hmm.
Another point that I think is important is all wrapped up in the Great Awakening thing on kind of the male-female front was, as I'm sure everyone remembers, the whole Me Too movement and the Believe All Women hashtag, and of course the famous Kavanaugh Hearings, nomination or approval hearings, or
Yeah.
whatever the technical term is. And it was like due process did not matter for a huge segment of the country, primarily white liberals. I mean, it was shocking to many people how horrible this was about we don't care about testimony and evidence and establishing, as the Bible says, everything on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. I mean, it was really bad, and unfortunately, again, I think that we in the Missouri Synod have to admit we have been infected by this as well. Let me read you. I like to play little games like this, reading quotes and people guessing where they're from. And I know you know where they're from, so you don't get to play. But but those of you who are listening, listen to some of these quotes from a church body's training manual for their domestic violence task force. It's a training manual, and let me just read a couple of these quotes for you. Well, first of all, the manual micromanages how pastors are to conduct couples counseling, and they literally insist that a pastor should screen for and functionally presume abuse when you're doing premarital counseling and stuff like that, or other couples counseling. And that you should consider, yeah, I know, it's crazy. And that you should consider meddling in other congregations. If someone who's not your parishioner comes to you, you should consider meddling. I mean, they don't use that word, but that's the advice. It's crazy. But there's a section they've got, who's telling the truth. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read this last line. Your attitude in all of this, like if people try to get you to say, I'm telling the truth. No, he said, she said, this kind of thing. Your attitude in all this should be simple. You are not there. You do not know the truth. You cannot know the truth. A related attitude is the realization that it is not necessary for you to know the truth. I mean, we're all about the truth. What? Yeah, I know. It's insane. However, it's interesting because you can see that the manual is very influenced by the Believe All Women, stuff, because the manual also says, the same booklet, assure the victim that you believe her. Have no hesitation whatsoever to tell her you believe her. I mean, you're supposed to give your word as a pastor when you don't actually know the truth of the matter yet. I mean, if there's really abuse going on, I do not know a single Missouri Synod pastor who wouldn't say, this needs to be stopped. This is wrong and evil, and it needs to be dealt with. But establishing the truth is a necessary thing that the Bible talks about repeatedly. I mean, it's just shocking. Here's another one talking about destroying the link between truth and reality. Domestic abuse is defined by its effect on the victim, not by the behavior during the abusive incidents. So it doesn't matter what really happened. I mean, I know that they probably would not say that, but I mean, that's functionally what you're doing. It doesn't matter what actually happened. It just matters how it made someone feel. I mean, this is the exact stuff that we see on our college campuses, even the Concordia ones about these bias incident reports. Somebody goes and tattles to the administration. Somebody hurt my feelings. Well, what did they say? Well, they said this, this, and that. Okay, well, that might be true. Maybe they wanted to debate you with something. Well, but it hurt me, and it's a bias against me because I'm white or black or a woman or trans or whatever. But yeah, abuse is defined by its effects on the victim, not by the behavior. I mean, that is incredible. It's just absolutely, it's just twisting truth and air. And of course, as I'm sure everyone could guess, these were all quotes from the LCMS, Domestic Violence Task Force Training Manual. So, yeah, this is in our church. I mean, I doubt anyone uses that manual because, like many official things, for better or for worse, they just sit on a website and nobody touches it. But I mean, you can just see the anti-biblical, psychological, and feminist presuppositions running through this. And that totally aligns with what happened in the mid teens, of where there is
Mhm.
this big shift of, well, it doesn't matter what absurd claim somebody comes up with, we have to believe it. And that's an assault not just on a particular man or woman who's been accused of something, but it's an assault on the nature of truth itself. And that's what's so insidious about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is, but it still is strange because it only operates in one direction. So, you had the whole Kavanaugh thing. And even before that, years before that, you had the Clarence Thomas stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
But when it's raised against like our current president, it goes nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is funny how when you it's not funny. I mean, it's demonic how when
It
you
is demonic.
undermine. Oh, it is absolutely. And when you undermine the proper establishment of truth and error, how now, of course, it becomes arbitrary, and it's just an appeal to authority who gets to determine who's right and
Yeah.
who's wrong, and who gets to establish truth and error by fiat. And isn't it interesting that particular groups and political parties, or the media in our current day, now that truth and error are kind of disestablished in the minds of many people, well, they can pick who we're supposed to believe. Believe all women except the ones that accuse this person or that person, Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the hypocrisy is rank. The scary thing is that I think that if you go back in our country's history, there was a much firmer respect for due process. And that's why the Great Awakening is the Great Awakening, because now you have, millions, literally millions of people who actually believe these absurd things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, the fact that it only operates in one direction, at least to any thinking person, should highlight the fact that this is not about truth
Yeah.
or finding the truth. That it's about power.
Absolutely. And if you are inhabiting a worldview that it's all about oppressors versus the oppressed, and you don't actually love the shape of God's creation, and you are just trying to upend everything for some utopian paradise, then it doesn't matter about establishing truth, because you already know what your utopian vision is, and it doesn't matter how you get there. And that's actually where I think, even on a more deeper level, not just to see the infection in the Missouri Synod in these particular cases, but why are we being infected by woke ideology, and why have we been affected by the Great Awakening? I mean, obviously, all of these commentators talk about, well, social media contributed to the Great Awakening, and everyone's on social media basically. And some people talk about the second Obama term radicalization once he didn't need to be reelected. There's all these very interesting theories, but I think that even if we can't sort all the how did this happen, we definitely know who were that shifted radically. And I think we in the Missouri Synod need to come to grips with the fact of why we've been so susceptible to it. And to put it succinctly, we in the Missouri Synod, we believe like fundamentalists, yet we live like liberal Protestants. And I think that's something that we need to take to heart. And we believe that the Bible is the Word of God. We have, very conservative positions on biblical morality and ethics and things like that. Yet we send our kids, by and large, to leftist-run colleges. Again,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to denigrate the fact that not everybody's a German American in the Missouri Synod. I mean, shoot, my last name is Ramirez. I'm not all German and not all white myself. But at the same time, we're talking about the broad picture, right? And
Yeah.
the Missouri Synod is 97% white or something like that. And, the biggest chunk of that is German by enormous figures. And so the fact
Yeah.
is that, if it's white liberals who have shifted, And yet so many of our young people have been affected. How is that, and why is that? And I think it's because, again, we believe very traditionally, so to speak, to put it in more cultural terminology, and yet we live like upper middle class liberal Protestants on the issue of sending our kids, I think, very uncritically off to leftist institutions for college. And then they swim uncritically in the culture. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that modern college education has a very negative effect, particularly on young women, in terms of delayed marriage, family formation, rejection of biblical morality, and falling away from the church. I mean, we all know this is happening. It's not like I'm saying something that's shocking or people don't know, but I mean, it's so pervasive and it's so bad. And you can see this again by the data. Let's take Black Lives Matter for instance, as an organization and as a movement, which I think is, a horrible organization, obviously, communistic and utopianistic, and bad news. I'm not going to try and support that. I think it's obvious. But anyway, the point is that if you drill down into the data of who actually supports BLM among white Americans, and if you take out are they Republican voters and Democratic voters, it is shocking to see the level of how college-educated women are so much more supportive of BLM. And then if you go up to post-grads, it's just even more shockingly supportive, especially the younger they get. And so I think that us, again, as a whole, uncritically sending specifically our daughters off, but there's been an effect on young men too, into these leftist institutions. Well, to put it succinctly, I'm just repeating myself. If you're going to send your kids to be trained by Canaanites, they're going to worship Molech. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It should not be surprising.
Yeah, it's the Vadi Baucom, I think that's his name, who says, why are we surprised if we keep sending our kids to be educated by Caesar that they come back Romans?
Yeah. I don't know that quote. I've heard his name passed around, but I don't really know anything about him. But that's a great quote. That's the same point.
Same idea, right?
Yeah, exactly. But underlying all of this, I think that we've got to have an attitude shift, frankly. Like, how are we going to push back? I mean, I threw out 3 data points, you know what I mean? Like, and the college one in some ways is the most important one. And there's lots of different solutions. Maybe not send your kids to college. That's a real easy solution. Or if you do, have them go to a local college so they stay at home with their church. I mean, I'm sure supporting campus ministry and cleaning up the Concordias, which are totally infected, those are good ideas too. I mean, different people are going to go at this in different ways, but what we're doing does not work, and we got to change. But even more fundamentally than the college issue, especially sending our girls off out of our protection as fathers, even more fundamentally, we got to change our attitude. One thing that is important is, I think, so long American Lutherans who are theologically confessional or conservative have considered themselves conservatives. Well, being a conservative presupposes you have something to conserve. And sure, there's some things that still are standing in America and in the Missouri Synod and ought to be conserved. So I don't totally reject the term. But I mean, come on, let's be honest. Christendom in the West is in shambles. And if we're going to fight back, we have to start thinking like counter-revolutionaries. I mean, I think of the French Revolution and, Thomas Fleming. He's just such a great political and cultural commentator. And I remember him talking about the post French Revolution era. I mean, those quote unquote conservatives that wanted to push back against that godless revolution, they weren't trying to conserve the revolution. They were counter-revolutionaries. They had to take back ground. They had to be much more aggressive and attack the ball instead of being eaten up by a grounder. And they wanted to confront the lies. And part of, I think, being more aggressive and understanding yourself as a counter-revolutionary is also you want to identify terms that really clarify the issue. To use two historical examples, you know, in seminary, you and I both studied, the debate over, the Trinitarian and Christological debates, and how Arius denied that the Son of God was truly God, and so Athanasius was the great hero. And the term that really finally smoked Arius out was homoousios or homoousia,
Right.
and of the same substance, not similar substance, but of the same substance of the Father. And we still use that term in our creed every Sunday when we have communion. It's in the Nicene Creed, and they had to use a term that really clarified the issue. They were looking for particularity. They were looking to draw very clear, hard lines. Same way with the Seminex fight in the Missouri Synod. I mean, a lot of the liberals who denied the scriptures, they could use the word infallibility, or that it was the word of God. And those terms are good, but they co-opted them or weaseled around them or redefined them. I mean, that's the old neo-Orthodox trick, to use Orthodox words and infuse them with liberal meaning. But what did our forefathers, what did our heroes do? They used the term inerrancy, because that was the word that drove them crazy, and they attacked it, and they kind of fled from it because they knew that was a term that was pretty impossible to weasel around. I think a term that we need to use, and I know that we've talked about this word before, and I know you've had other people on who've talked about it, is the word patriarchy. I mean, patriarchy is a word that the woke really despise. I mean, isn't that what we've seen for the last 10 years?
Yep.
Smash the patriarchy, down with the patriarchy. And we should embrace that term. It is a wonderful term because we got a divine patriarch. That's good. It's good that God made the nations. It's good that God made us man and woman. It's good that God is our patriarch and that we live in a patriarchy, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. But if there's a term that your enemy hates, you should think about using it. And I think that's a great term.
Yeah, because it does clarify the lines, doesn't it? Instead of just kind of living in gray zone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, think about, all the debates throughout the Missouri Synod's history over headship. Well, headship doesn't really mean this. It really means this, and on and on and on. I mean, built into the word patriarchy, rule of the fathers. I mean, it's right. I mean, I'm sure the devil can subvert any term, but you don't purposefully pick a dull sword. You pick a sharp one, and that's a sharp one. And
the interesting thing is that, I mean, I think what we're finding is that you will either have a godly patriarchy or a demonic one.
Yeah.
I mean, so, all of the kind of shrieking about men becoming women and entering women's sports, and I mean, what you end up finding is you're still going to have a rule of fathers, but it's just going to be a totally disordered one.
Yeah. It's like your
It'd
favorite
just be
poet
by the father
says.
of lies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like your favorite poet says, you're going to have to serve somebody. You're going to have to serve God
Bob
or the
Dylan.
devil. See? You are 10 years older than me. You caught the reference.
It doesn't mean I'm 10 years older than you.
Okay, fair enough. I know the reference too.
You knew it.
Yeah. I actually used it in my presentation because it's an insightful line. I mean, it is. It just reflects what the Bible teaches, or like what you said. You're going to serve the Father of us all. You're going to love His rule, His fatherly grace and mercy and kingship, or you're going to be following the father of lies. There's no middle ground. And well, joking aside about references to songs from the 60s, I don't even know if that's a 60s or 70s song, but I do think that we've talked about the Missouri Synod and how we can push back in general, well, I guess we've been specific, but to get back to your question about the who, well, you asked
Yeah.
who shifted. I mean, how are we going to push back? We shouldn't just think about we corporately as a church. That's important. And what issues, but also how we as particular people who are part of particular generations. I mean, obviously all Christians are called to be faithful, but we are in different situations. And I do think how to push back is going to be different from each generation.
Yeah. I think you raise a great point, because what you saw over the past 10 years, besides this seismic shift, is a lot of finger pointing
Yeah.
at particular generations.
Yeah.
So how do you ameliorate that? How do you overcome it? And
which I'm
and
sure
how
like
should
you and I are totally guiltless of, right?
Yeah, no, we are not guiltless.
We are not guiltless of this.
No, there are times, when you've had a bad day and you just are like, if it weren't for all this kind of generation, life would be good.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the
Well, I mean,
generational finger.
there is
Yeah.
plenty of room for, as I'm pointing the finger at someone else, for fingers to be pointed back at me, because my generation is big on complaint and pretty small on action.
Well, and that's why, I mean, like, whenever there's a seismic shift, it upends everything. And I mean, the father of lies wants us to hate each other generationally, too. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there are very legitimate critiques against the boomers and,
Yeah.
as you just alluded to, the Gen Xers, and very legitimate critiques against the millennials and now the Zoomers who are, coming of age right now. But and I actually think that there's a good, healthy critique between the generations. Obviously excluding it descending into just ridiculousness. But but how we can push back and strengthen each other. I mean, that's part of building the patriarchy. I mean, they want to smash the patriarchy. We want to build it, and part of that is not just building a brotherhood among those who are just your peer group. I mean, that's one of the big problems with the modern, Dewey Prussian school system, of where you are atomized into these generational peer groups. I mean, there's a time and a place to break out generationally and to break out in your peer group, but it is to the extent that it disrupts familial, patriarchal bonding and the passing down of the faith, the culture, the traditions of home and hearth, and all that kind of stuff. And so, if we're going to push,
so it's kind of like the tactic of Absalom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If only I were in charge.
Yes.
If only I could give you justice. Let me kneel down and kiss your feet. Or he doesn't kiss their feet, but he comes down from his chariot or whatever, and I'm a man of the people. You always got to be suspicious about elites who say that they're real men of the people when all their behavior points in the opposite direction.
Right.
Yeah, no. So I mean, generationally, I think that it is interesting to see the reactions to the Great Awokening and this huge seismic shift in religious and political beliefs among specifically white liberals, but which has totally remade the religious and political landscape in America. And to see how quote unquote conservative or confessional Lutherans who have not been shifted, by that, how they've responded to the shift. And I think boomers, generally speaking, because when you get older, you don't have your finger on the pulse of the culture like you did when you were a kid. I mean, that's not just true of the boomers. That's just built into the cake. That's just how it works. And so I think for them, they're oh my goodness, how did this happen? What is going on? I mean, obviously they see it, they feel it, but I think that it is very shocking. And then I think, frankly, the one thing that the boomers have more so than later generations, again, just built into the cake, is that they have a much bigger memory and experience of a much more normal and more Christian America. And that is something that sometimes I know you and I, not just personally, but generationally as Gen Xers, sometimes get angry about, because it's like, look at what you had. Why didn't you preserve it better? Look at what you had and you took it for granted.
Yep.
But at the same time, those boomers do have a gift, and they got to experience a much better America and a better, more stable Christian culture and society. It wasn't perfect. I don't want to repristinate the 50s. And I think that's where perhaps, the younger generations can give a gift back to the boomers of, them having a bigger, longer view. I mean, that's what our elders can give us, their wisdom and their bigger, broader view that they have, because of their experiences and their years on this earth. But I think a gift that the younger generations can give to the boomers is, the solution is not to repristinate the 1950s or, your childhood, because the rot was already there. There are, to use the word systemic problems in the country and in American Christianity and even in Lutheranism in the 50s. That was not a golden era to try and that we should repristinate. And so I do think that a gift that the Gen Xers and the younger generations can give them is to say, yes, you are shocked and appalled, even though it's not as surprising to us. But, you should look at this and consider some of the things that you thought were so great that maybe they weren't so great. Kind of like, I've heard countless people, even Missouri Synod people, well, first wave feminism was bad. I mean, good, but second wave feminism, that was the problem, and it's like,
Right.
no. I mean, that wonderful book, Why is Feminism So Hard to Resist by Paul Harris. I mean, first wave feminism was humanistic evil stuff. It was horrible. And some of the stuff that in, kind of the Norman Rockwell vision of America that just seems so wholesome actually really wasn't totally wholesome.
Yeah.
So I think the younger generations can give that. Another thing that I think, about the millennials and now the upcoming Zoomers, they've been swimming in it, and it's just the air that they breathe far more than not just the boomers, but even us as Gen Xers. I mean, we had the multi-culti stuff in the 90s, but once you get out into the real world, it wasn't as crazy or as bad. But now that is the real world. The whole world is like a bunch of grievance study majors yelling at everyone. And so I think that that's what the millennials and Zoomers bring to the table, in the sense that they can really, see it from the inside and help people understand even more of the contours and more of the particularities of the problem and of the enemy, because what is going on from the inside, and that's an important perspective. Which I guess
that means you actually have to talk to each other, right?
Yeah, you got to talk to each other. You got to learn from each other. You got to be humble. I mean, of course, I love those memes of, the boomer and the millennial yelling at each other, and then the Gen X are just sitting back, like smoking a cigarette, going, "This is hilarious." Just like, I'm not even involved in this. But to kind of
there's an entire Saturday Night Live skit on that.
I know that it's so
funny.
Last
time it was funny.
Yeah, it probably was. I haven't watched that in a long time. But I do think, to circle back, so I kind of skipped over the Gen Xers, and I guess every generation has, I think, important things to reflect upon and repent of or be critical of, but also gifts to give. I mean, these younger generations have zeal to give, and that's what's given to young people, a lot of zeal. And the boomers, they have a broader perspective. They have much bigger ties to the past, and so they need to give the wisdom that they have, and while they can't give it. And I think that the Gen Xers, who are now kind of starting to take over in terms of lots of leadership positions in, the nation and the church and other places. I think that what the Gen Xers can be is in some ways kind of a bridge, because,
Hmm.
I mean, I, I in the 80s and the 90s, there were no cell phones. I mean, we didn't live in the world today. I think my childhood was probably a lot closer to my parents than to my kids, my kids are Zoomers and beyond. But I mean, I think there's a big breach there with the information revolution that we all lived through, and I think the
Yeah.
Gen Xers really. It's incumbent upon us to not be the slackers, or the jaded dude smoking in the back with his coffee, just making fun of everything, but to actually, step up and say, no, let's actually do something. Let's lead. Let's build. Let's go out there and help bind those generations together, because the generations older than the boomers there's a few still with us, but not many. And the Zoomers really aren't totally on the scene yet. They are getting on the scene now, but Gen Xers got to play kind of a bridge building role here,
Yeah.
and not just be so jaded and totally critical of institutions and everything like that, but rather actually help build the patriarchy that God wants for us to have in the home and in the church and in society. So
Yeah. But one of the things I think, Gen Xers are really good at is kind of tearing things apart to see how
yeah,
see what's there. The problem is, like, we don't put it back together. We just tear it apart. We're
yeah.
the kid that takes something apart to see how it works, but then we forgot how to put it back together.
Well, yeah, I think some people like overblow the whole generational thing, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to us right now are like, you guys are just overblowing it. But there is truth to it, and
Yeah.
I mean, you can't escape where you came from. You're always going to be who you are, where you grew up, what generation. It's going to affect you to a certain extent, and
Mhm.
yeah, we gotta work on that. Yeah, I got to think more about what you just said. The Gen Xers pull it apart or deconstruct it or whatever, and then they don't build. Yeah, that's probably a weakness. It's weird. Because I'm so much younger than you, I'm kind of on the cusp of
You're
Gen
not
X,
that
and
much.
I don't know. I'm pretty much younger than you, I think. But
Well,
well,
you
you were
are
born in
younger, but like 4 years.
yeah. You're what, 77?
Yes.
You're 77. So I'm 81, which I know some people would say that I am a millennial, but I think that the cell phone divide is too great. Um, but I know I'm on the cusp, and I think that it's always been interesting to me to hear Gen Xers and, like, yeah, I know I'm a Gen Xer, but like I do understand some of the millennial stuff. One of my buddies here in the circuit, Pastor Jim Remke, Remke.
Yeah.
He calls himself an elder millennial, which I don't think that's actually fair, because he was born in the 70s too. Wait, is he 80 or 79? Either way, I don't know. Yeah, Jack Gilbert, another circuit buddy of mine, he says that the cutoff is 80, but I think it's 83. So anyway,
Okay.
my point is that I think the generational thing is kind of fun to gripe about. It's fun to analyze, and I know
Hmm.
it can be overblown, but I mean, I do think that when you have something like the Great Awokening that happens, I mean, it just pits people against each other. And I know that you have your gripes about the boomers and the millennials, and so do I. But I mean, we got to learn how to work together, if we're going to actually confront the issues of the day. Because the Great Awakening and the levels of absurdity, I mean, it's just crazy. People don't even, they can't even define what a man is or what a woman is. I mean,
Yeah.
we need to have clear answers, and we're going to, and I just pray that the boomers in their, gray years, that they use the wisdom and the resources that they have now to help out their their descendants. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And not just physical descendants, but spiritual descendants.
Right.
Don't help the enemy, help your own. And I really hope that the Gen Xers can, be a bridge and, take leadership in a wise and helpful way. And you see the millennials and the Zoomers rising up, and I fear for lots of them blackpilling, as that cultural slang term of just getting depressed about everything. And it's like, no, even though you've grown up in a woke world, that's not everything. There is a history, and more importantly, there's a future to work for and to look forward to. So.
Yeah, blackpilling is just, the slang term for sloth.
Yeah. Have you said that before?
I just did.
Okay, well.
This is the first time I've said it.
Yeah. That's a good one. It's another term for sloth. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, it's a total check out. Just get to the point where you just don't care.
Yeah. Yeah, I know
and that you have no hope.
Yeah. Yeah, blackpilling is a temptation. It's evil.
It is. Any final thoughts besides we got to get together, suggestions for doing that, or just, when you find wherever you're at, just to do it?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to build the patriarchy, a godly patriarchy, then people need to get together. I mean, pastors need to form a brotherhood where they're at, or, talk to other pastors on the phone, come to the Booganagan conference. Fathers need to strengthen their familial relationships, among their own, but also, hang out with other guys. And, I think that is just so critical. And when men lead, women do follow. And so if you have a pastor who is wanting to get people together around the Word of God, that's gonna trickle down to every man, woman, and child in the congregation. And of course, laymen and laywomen should be encouraging that in whatever their duties and stations are in the congregation as well, that we gather together, because that's what the devil's always about, isolating us, whether it be generationally or men and women or whatever. He's just trying to pick us off like that predator he is. And we need to not allow that to happen. So we need to band together and gather around the Word of God, gather around hearth and home, and really just, I mean, that's the conversation and consolation of the brethren. Our confessions talk about that all the time. It's so important. And not be lone rangers. Man, when the enemy is all around you, that's the last thing that you want to do, is to just be on your own. That is so dangerous, because then pride and temptation just take over.
Yeah. Kind of what St. Paul says when he's speaking to the church in Ephesus about, stand guard with the whole armor of God, that you stay where you've been put, either as fathers or mothers. You stay in that spot and you stand guard, knowing that, the war has already been won, and we just need to stay where we've been put, instead of being drawn away from that spot, leaving a gap for the enemy to make his way in.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your time.
Yeah. Yeah. Great to be on.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Have a good one. Bye-bye.